It is every Nintendo handheld fan's dream. It is the end game for many a handheld modder. It is the Game Boy Pocket Color. I'm your cool Uncle Marissa, and today I'm going to talk to you about why, instead of building this one, you should just get good. So first off, a little bit of history, especially because I know that a lot of my nerd fuse are more nephews than nerds, and I appreciate that so much. I really love those of you who watch these videos because
I just think they're neat.
So we know the Game Boy succession line generally to be the original Game Boy, the Game Boy Color, and then the Game Boy Advance, followed by the Game Boy Advance spin-off of the SP, the oft-forgotten Micro, and then into the DS line. But there was a little bit more between all that. In 1996, they came out with the Game Boy Pocket. The Game Boy Pocket is the original Game Boy, but in this form factor. Now this is really nice form factor in my opinion. This is peak Game Boy form factor. It's flat. It doesn't have the thick butt that Game Boy Color does, so it can rest flat, and the front is also, it's small, it's compact, it's just lovely. And then in the spring of 1998, they came out with the Game Boy Light, which is a Japanese exclusive Game Boy, and it's what it sounds like. It's a Game Boy, but it has a light, so you can actually see what you're playing. Then later that year, they released the Game Boy Color. Now it's so interesting that the Game Boy Color didn't come out with a light after the Game Boy Light came out just months prior. So I mean, I personally think it's because Nintendo didn't want to lose the grip on the economy that worm lights had. They knew that they were going to be the next big thing. It would just be too disruptive. So I am personally camp Wormlight conspiracy, and if you think otherwise, especially if your belief is rooted in cold hard facts, I will disown you. Anyway, the Pocket, beautiful form factor. The Light has similar, if not the same form factor. I'm not sure, I don't own one. So of course the modding community thought to themselves, how do we put the Game Boy Color, which while not as bulky as the original Game Boy, is bulkier than the Pocket and Light, into a body of a Game Boy Pocket? From what I personally saw, the first big project to answer that was by Cypher. Cypher did a lot of incredible things in the Game Boy modding community, and I say did because he is now sort of retiring from that and going on to a new chapter in his life, so wish him all the best there. His tutorial still exists on YouTube, and his method is basically cutting off the bottom of your Game Boy Color PCB and putting it into a Game Boy Pocket. Now that is very reductive, but for the essence of time, that's essentially it. And when I first saw it, I was nowhere near the skill level to be able to achieve that. Cutting a Game Boy PCB sounded to me like walking in front of a truck. It just did not sound like something that would have a positive outcome. Soon after, I got to the point where I felt like I would be comfortable doing what Cypher's instructions detail, but there was always the thing for me that Cypher's design omits the battery contacts and instead goes with a LiPo mod. So, you know, a rechargeable battery, the kind you find in your cell phone. And when it comes to Game Boys, I am very much team battery, like AA's, AAA's. I get the rechargeable ones. I recommend them always when anyone asks. And around the same time, Natalie of Natalie the Nerd fame, renown, and respect started to talk about her version of a Pocket Color, which would use the original batteries. And I was hyped. A lot of us were really hyped. People kept bugging her. Honestly, lots of sympathy to Natalie on having to deal with all of that. But it was just so exciting to have another version of this mod come out and be accessible to people, as accessible as Cypher's was. Soon after, we got more information about Natalie's build, and eventually, you know, it was released on her website, and hers is a half and half. So it is the top half of a Game Boy Color attached to a reproduction PCB half of a Pocket that she has built. And you solder these together using a flex board. Now, immediately this sounds much simpler in a way. You are getting all the materials, you don't have to create a bunch of holes in the shell that you would with ciphers, you are not losing the battery, you're not losing the headphone jack, none of that, everything stays. And again, for me, the battery was of utmost importance. What's interesting is around the time that Natalie released that's when a lot of other makers, and in my eyes, Genius, has started releasing their versions, but all of the other versions are a board. So it's a board and you either purchase parts for it or you move them from a donor Game Boy Color board onto the new board. Of course, those require micro soldering and the use of a hot air station or a hot plate. But anyway, let's focus on Natalie's. So I'd like to open with the pros. So Natalie clearly has put a lot of time and effort into this project with what seems to be the goal of making this user-friendly, accessible, and what she says to be the easiest Pocket Color mod on the market. And I think that when we look at it, immediately it is the easiest because all you need to do is hand solder. You're not removing any small components, you are removing large components such as a headphone jack, power switch, things that you can very easily do by eyesight and a trusty soldering iron on your own. She also has a very clear troubleshooting guide and installation guide that's very, not too much detail, very step-by-step IKEA style, which I think is a lot more consumer friendly, as aside from Cypher and his YouTube videos, the others tend to be GitHub readmes, which it could be overwhelming if you're looking at it for the first time and could be off-putting as well. In terms of what's included in the package, the bottom board, which is essentially a pocket bottom reproduction, is very sturdy. It's very nice. It's very clean. It comes with tactile buttons that you can peel off, which is a very nice instant mod for if that's something that you are after. But unfortunately, where this project and design failed for me is the thing that attaches that very nice black Pocket Color board, or rather pocket board, to the top half of the Game Boy Color. The flex board is, to put it simply, extremely flimsy. I've worked with a lot of quick solder flex boards, and I think the thinnest that I've ever used is the X Station for the PlayStation 1, where essentially you replace the disk drive with an SD card. But while it was thin, it was sturdy, and the connectors, all the solder points were very sturdy and stiff as well. So the fact that it is very thin, it is very easy, in my opinion, to tear. Now, I didn't tear mine, but the entire board folds in half very easily, and it's quite nerve-wracking because it's so thin that I am worried that it'll tear. But now that's just a worry. So what are some actual hurdles that I faced? If you've kept up with Natalie, you know that she loves soldering to vias, and it's very smart, especially with clear builds, because it's not intrusive. So it is no surprise that this is a very via heavy project, and the flex board sits on the vias. So it looks clean. But the flex board, again, is incredibly flimsy. The connectors, they don't have any sort of stiffness to them, and they are very small. So once you solder through them, you don't really have any ability to see what's going on. This is especially challenging for the areas which have clusters, for example, the Start AB vias, because you could possibly bridge those if you're not careful, and you won't be able to see that you've bridged them because you can't see anything. Some other quick solder boards I have experience with will have a sort of more of an oval shape that encompasses all of the clumped together points. And I think that could be very helpful because then you can see if anything is bridged because you have that openness. And with that, we're talking about checking our work, and it's kind of impossible to check your work. You have to get this one and done. If you do it incorrectly once or twice and you don't establish the connection as you need, you can't really fix it easily because the solder points are so flimsy that after applying heat a couple of times, they just come off. The pads just rip off. And then you're either stuck getting a new flex board, which I did end up doing because the first time that I did this, I soldered it by eye, and Natalie was really kind and sent me 2 flex boards just for the price of shipping, and I really appreciated the extra one just in case I messed up again. But that really sucks because quick solder boards, flex boards are really hard to remove once you put them down, even the smallest ones like the Xenomod. But it's not impossible with enough flux and, just patience. But with this, it's sort of impossible to remove it. And when you remove it, you are going to lift pads off the quick solder board. You might even lift a pad off of your Game Boy, especially if it's old or it's not doing too hot, which might be the case because when you're choosing a Game Boy board to sacrifice to this project, you might pick one that's a little on the dodgier side. Another thing that you can visually see that really hits home how weak the flex board is it develops pinched in wrinkles around where you solder. And that sort of takes me to the next point of alignment. So we are attaching these 2 boards with a flex board, and then we need everything to be aligned to place in the pocket case. However, it's very hard to get everything to be perfectly straight due to the fact that the flex board is so malleable and so easy for it to deform. So one side will end up higher than the other, and it might not even be visible to the naked eye, but once you put it in the pocket, you'll realize you have to sort of move it around, and then that's kind of wrinkling the board, and then, the flex board might pop off of the points you've put it on if it's not perfect. And the thing about this project is it was such a butterfly domino effect of errors. As soon as one thing would be fixed, because the connections are so delicate, another thing would pop off. And I think delicate connections are not ideal for something like this because especially if you are a modder, you're going to go back in and you might add new features, you might change out your screen, your buttons, and just the fact that every time I touched it, I felt like something was going to break because sometimes it did. It just doesn't seem like the best way to go about it. What I do have to give credit for is on the other side, the points that do solder onto the board, onto the pocket board that she's made, those are very strong. Another part of the flex board is a teeny tiny flex board that you desolder the power switch, because the power switch for the pocket is on the top, and you put it onto this little board and you move it to the top. Now, how does it sit on the top? So it says place adhesive here. Natalie recommends using the 3M adhesive that can come with IPS screens, but it just would not stay for me. It was not strong enough for the pressure of the button turning it on and off. And some adhesives I tried were the 3M that Natalie suggests on her page, hot glue, which is a very vintage modder of me, and also the adhesive that you use to glue phone screens back on. I've used that also to DIY laminate Game Boy screens, which was part of a project for this. It is very strong, but it just would not sit under the pressure of flicking that power switch. Now I understand why it has to be that thin. It has to be that thin so that the power switch of the Pocket can actually reach it, because the power switch button assumes that it's going to be gripping like this. The power switch would cause my the switch on the board to move the adhesive, and it would ultimately sort of flick over it and just lose contact with it. Sorry, they're both power switches, so I know that it might be hard to keep track of the differentiation. The power switch that's on the board, the power button like that you flick on the Pocket. Another thing that was interesting, I noted the tactile switches. The tactile switches were actually causing interference for me and causing my button presses not to register. And it was one of those things where I was checking my work and the multimeter was telling me everything was connected. And I thought, what if I peel off the tactile switches? And I did, and it was making contact again. So I don't know what was going on. I don't know if it was just, user error and it was like too grubby or something at that point from overwork. But if you do end up doing this, that's something to keep in mind. If your button presses aren't reading, maybe try it with the tactile switch stickers peeled off. Another thing that I think is a must for this project is a microscope. I initially did it without a microscope and it was just horrible, but because the flex board points are so tiny and you are working with small vias and you can't see them because the flex board holes are essentially the same size as the vias, you're gonna want to zoom in. That helped me a lot, and that's part of why I feel like I'm more confident in this kind of critique, because even with being able to see everything, there was still just a lack of integrity, structural. And I talked to Natalie a lot throughout this. She helped me a lot with troubleshooting, and she was very generous with her time, and I really appreciate that. It can definitely be a good exercise in patience. It's a good exercise in soldering two vias, but also you have a very big risk of damaging not just the mod, but your Game Boy Color. Now, I am going to keep following this project because Natalie is going to keep doing revisions on it, and I'm actually very excited to see what she's going to change. And I'm confident that eventually she's going to come up with something that is not just user-friendly, but also has that structural integrity. She has actually printed on the next boards, I think if you check her Instagram, skill issue. And while I agree that you do need to have a lot of skill in order to do this, a lot of soldering skill, I feel like it's a luck issue too, because you can't check your work easily and you can't really undo things. So you're sitting there being like, okay, but Uncle, what did you mean by get good? Honestly, I think that if you are set on making a Pocket Color, it just makes more sense to go that extra mile and get yourself used to micro soldering and using a hot air rework station or a hot plate and getting a Pocket Color board where you are moving components onto the board and building it from scratch, because a board is going to have integrity, and once it's all set together, it's going to be like dealing with any other Game Boy board. You don't have to worry about it bending, you don't have to worry about it not fitting in the shell. If there's any trimming needed, that's usually included in the documentation. Some people that I know currently have Pocket Color boards available are Bucket Mouse, who also does make power regulators for them, and 64 Freak, and Skimzor. I'll put their links down in the description. I really want to do one of these. I think I'm gonna try Bucket Mouses, but I need a hot air rework station to practice with. You can, shameless, but if you donate to my Ko-Fi, that can help me to raise some money to go buy one. Probably what I'm going to do first, and what I would also recommend to you if you're suddenly really excited to try this and you want to know, well, how should I practice? What's the best way? Bucket Mouse does have the power regulator board that comes unassembled, and you can buy that, and you can buy all the components that go on it, and you can practice from there your micro soldering as well as using hot air or hot plate. At least that's what I'm going to do. There is another option that is way easier than all of this. Boxy Pixel, the folks behind the Unhinged and just in general everything being very metal. They have a Game Boy Pocket shell that fits the Game Boy Color internals, and I think that is very cool. I'm not a fan of metal. I just love me some kitty plastic that, you know, you can just put stickers on and it feels warm and it feels like a toy. So I would actually really love to see someone producing those shells but in plastic so that you can sort of get that form factor. I'm sure it's off by a bit, but you know, that does look like the ultimate user-friendly way to make a Game Boy Pocket Color. And no one's out there going to be like, well, show me the internals and show me the work you did. They're gonna be like, hey, that's a cool Game Boy Pocket Color. And you're like, thanks, it's just a Game Boy Pocket shell. That would be neat. Someone do that. I will buy one. But yeah, that's my review. This is all subjective opinion and none of this is sponsored, and I do encourage you to follow Natalie's project because I'm, again, very excited to see where it goes. This is just, it feels like a very beta version, and it's something that has not been done before, so starting from scratch like that is very impressive to me, and is obviously going to come with some kinks, even if those include literal physical kinks in the flex board. Otherwise, I really hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you so much. Shout out to Chillwatt who donated to my Ko-Fi. That means a lot. I'm able to get stuff to work on and show you guys, and yeah, so I appreciate that. And let me know, do you have a pocket color? Are you interested in making one? Which of these methods sound the most appealing to you? Would you be happy just throwing everything into a shell? Because like low-key, I kind of would be. I know that's not very modern of me, but yeah. Otherwise, I've been your cool Uncle Marissa, and never forget, cool Uncle loves you. See you next time.